The wind howling through the courtyard of the black marble palace was merciless, but it was nothing compared to the cruelty of the Iron Peak pack. Elara Thorne knelt on the frozen stones. She wore a frayed, ash-stained servant's dress that offered no protection against the biting winter. Around her neck rested a heavy, rusted iron collar. It was the mark of an abandoned Omega, a visible chain meant to remind her that she was worth less than the dirt beneath their boots. Above her stood Lyra, the daughter of Elder Silas, draped in a pristine white fur cloak that brushed elegantly against the snow. Lyra smiled, a cold and calculated expression, before she kicked the heavy wooden bucket of freezing water Elara had been carrying across the courtyard. The bucket shattered. Ice water soaked into the hem of Elara's ragged dress, and the impact sent her crashing down. Her bare knees hit the jagged, frozen marble. A sharp gasp escaped Elara's lips, but she immediately swallowed it down. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress, staining the pure white snow beneath her with drops of crimson. The gathered pack members laughed. The sound echoed off the high, dark walls of the palace. The humiliation was absolute, designed to break whatever spirit the Omega had left. But Elara did not cry. She slowly pushed herself up, her frozen, bruised hands pressing against the ice. Her deep hazel eyes, flecked with unspoken gold, locked onto Lyra. There was no submission in her gaze, only a quiet, untouchable stillness that made the surrounding laughter falter for a fraction of a second. High above the courtyard, standing on the royal balcony, Alpha King Cailan Vance watched the scene unfold. He was a vision of absolute authority, dressed in a midnight blue royal coat with silver epaulets that caught the pale morning light. His posture was rigid, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. As the ruler of Iron Peak, Cailan was bound by the ancient, unforgiving laws of his father. To him, order was everything. Weakness was a disease, and Omegas were the lowest rung of their society. He should have looked away. He should have let the pack discipline their servant. But then, Elara's blood hit the snow. The moment the crimson drop stained the white frost, something violent and terrifying snapped inside Cailan's chest. Black Lycan within him, a beast known for its cold, calculated control, slammed against his ribs with a deafening, primal roar. Cailan's breath hitched. His jaw locked so tightly his teeth ached. His ice-blue eyes dilated, entirely consumed by the sight of the fragile girl on the ground. Why was his wolf reacting? She was just a servant, an abandoned Omega. Then the wind shifted. A scent drifted up to the high balcony. It was incredibly faint, nearly buried beneath the stench of the crowding pack and the heavy iron of her collar. But it pierced straight through Cailan's senses. It smelled of fresh winter frost and white lilies. The scent wrapped around his lungs, tight and demanding, pulling at an invisible string he didn't know existed. Down in the courtyard, Lyra stepped closer, her shadow falling over Elara. "Look at you," Lyra sneered, her voice carrying easily in the cold air. "A pathetic, wolfless stray bleeding on my family's stones. Clean this mess with your bare hands, Omega, and then you will bow your head and beg for my forgiveness." Elara slowly wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. Her fingers grazed the rusted iron collar that chafed her skin. The magic bound within the metal pulsed, designed to keep her weak, to keep her hidden. but it could not strip her of her dignity. "I will clean the stone," Ilara said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a strange, resonant authority that defied her ragged appearance. "Because it is my duty. But I will not bow to you, Lyra. Not today, not ever." A collective gasp rippled through the courtyard. The pack braced themselves. An Omega defying a high-ranking noble was a death sentence. Lyra's face twisted in fury. She raised a leather riding crop, ready to bring it down across Ilara's face. On the balcony, Kaelin's gloved hand clamped down on the stone railing. The solid marble cracked audibly beneath his grip. He did not shout. He did not issue a command to save her. His stubborn pride and the heavy weight of the kingdom's law kept his tongue tied, but he could not stop his alpha aura. Without a word, a suffocating, freezing pressure dropped over the courtyard like a physical avalanche. The air grew instantly heavy. The laughing pack members choked, their knees buckling under the sheer oppressive weight of their king's silent fury. Lyra froze mid-swing, the riding crop trembling in her hand as the breath was sucked from her lungs. She looked up at the balcony in absolute terror. Kaelin stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed only on Ilara. Sensing the sudden shift in the air, Ilara slowly lifted her head. Through the gently falling snow, her deep hazel eyes met his piercing ice-blue stare. The world around them seemed to dissolve into a heavy, suspended silence. At that exact second, the rusted iron collar around Ilara's neck grew strangely warm against her bruised skin. A microscopic hairline fracture, thinner than a strand of hair, snapped across the ancient iron. No one heard it break. No one in the courtyard saw it happen. But inside Kaelin's chest, his black lichen let out a low, possessive rumble that shook the Alpha King to his very core. The crushing weight of Kaelin's alpha aura vanished as quickly as it had fallen. In the courtyard, wolves gasped for air, clutching their chests and stepping back. Lyra dropped the leather riding crop, her hand trembling uncontrollably as she stared up at the empty balcony. The Alpha King was gone. Before anyone could speak, the heavy obsidian doors of the palace swung open. Kaelin Vance stepped out into the biting cold. The pack instantly parted, lowering their heads in absolute submission. Kaelin moved with deliberate, lethal grace. His midnight blue royal coat swept over the snow, his polished boots making no sound. He did not look at the bowing nobles or the terrified guards. His ice-blue eyes were fixed straight ahead, locked onto the small, fragile figure kneeling by the shattered bucket. Ilara had not moved. Her bare, bruised knees were still pressed against the frozen marble. The crimson stain from her torn dress had already begun to freeze into the snow. Kaelin halted a few feet away from her. The scent hit him again, stronger this time. It was a maddening contradiction. The delicate, sweet fragrance of white lilies tangled with the sharp, biting edge of winter frost. It bypassed his human logic completely, sinking straight into his blood. His bee, black lichen, paced frantically within his mind, clawing at the cages of his iron-clad discipline. "My king," Lyra stammered, stepping forward with a hastily composed smile, though her voice shook. "This Omega was disrespecting the natural order of our pack. I was simply enforcing the discipline your father established." Kaelin turned his gaze slowly to Lyra. The temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Discipline," Kaelin repeated, his voice smooth, quiet, and terrifyingly cold. Is the sacred rite of the High Council. It is not a theatrical spectacle to be performed in my courtyard like common entertainment. Lyra's face drained of colour. I only meant to. You meant to make a mess on my stones. Kaelin cut her off effortlessly. He glanced down at the shattered bucket and the ruined water. You have disrupted the palace's morning operations over a spilled bucket. Do not mistake cruelty for leadership, Lyra. It makes you look weak. The words were a calculated, devastating blow to Lyra's pride. Whispers broke out among the pack. Kaelin had not explicitly defended the Omega. He had framed it entirely around palace decorum. But the shield he threw over Elara was undeniable. Kaelin looked back down at Elara. "Get up," he ordered, his tone devoid of warmth. Elara slowly rose to her feet. The icy wind whipped her ragged, ash-stained dress around her thin frame. She was shivering, though she fought desperately to hide it. When she lifted her chin to look at him, Kaelin felt a strange jolt in his chest. There was no fear in her hazel eyes, only a quiet, guarded dignity that had no business belonging to an abandoned servant. His gaze dropped to her neck. The rusted iron collar looked impossibly heavy against her delicate skin. Dark, angry bruises bloomed around the edges of the metal, evidence of years of chafing and abuse. His wolf snarled internally, a violent urge to rip the metal from her throat taking hold of him. Kaelin's fingers twitched at his sides. He had to force his hands to remain perfectly still. He noticed it then, a microscopic hairline fracture along the rusted iron, faintly glowing with a strange residual heat. He blinked, and the glow was gone. Was it a trick of the snow and light? "You are shivering, Omega," Kaelin stated, his voice tight with restrained tension. "It is winter, my king," Elara replied. Her voice was steady, despite the cold numbing her lips. "I am accustomed to it." The fact that she spoke directly to him without lowering her gaze should have angered him. Instead, it only deepened the invisible pull tugging at his ribs. Kaelin's jaw tightened. He could not leave her out here to freeze, nor could he openly show favor to a low-ranking servant without inciting the wrath of the Elder Council. He needed an excuse. "Your disruption has cost the palace valuable time," Kaelin said, his voice projecting clearly for the entire courtyard to hear. "I will not have laziness masquerading as punishment. Since you are so keen to avoid your duties in the cold, you will report to the abandoned library tower immediately." Lyra's eyes widened. "My king! The library tower has not been cleaned in decades. It is freezing and filled with heavy archives." "Then it is fitting labor for an Omega who causes scenes," Kaelin interrupted smoothly, his eyes never leaving Elara's. "She will remain there until the archives are sorted. Out of sight." It was a brilliant lie. The abandoned library tower was indeed dusty, but it was indoors, shielded from the lethal winter winds, and most importantly, it had a hearth. It was the only place in the Black Marble Palace where the pack rarely ventured. Elara studied his face for a fraction of a second. She saw the cold, demanding Alpha King, but beneath that mask, she saw the subtle tension in his broad shoulders. She did not thank him. She simply offered a stiff, formal nod. "As you command, Alpha King," she said. She turned and walked past Lyra, her torn dress dragging slightly against the snow. She walked with a straight spine, completely ignoring the whispering nobles. Cailan watched her go, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, to hide the fact that his knuckles had turned white. The scent of lilies and frost lingered in the air long after she disappeared through the heavy obsidian doors. As Ilara walked down the dimly lit stone corridors toward the tower, she pressed her cold, bruised fingers against the rusted iron collar. The metal, which had been freezing just moments ago, was now humming with a faint, impossible warmth. Something inside her, something that had been asleep for a very long time, was beginning to wake up. The abandoned library tower was exactly as Lyra had described, freezing, shrouded in decades of thick dust, and painfully quiet. Yet as the heavy oak door closed behind her, Ilara felt a profound sense of relief. Here, there were no judging eyes. There were no nobles waiting to trip her, and no freezing water to carry. Ilara stood in the center of the circular room. Her ragged, ash-stained dress clung to her shivering frame, and her bruised knees ached with a dull, throbbing pain from her fall in the courtyard. But she did not reach for a broom. Instead, she walked straight toward the towering mahogany bookshelves that lined the curved stone walls. She was an Omega, supposedly weak and wolfless, but she was not ignorant. For months, the rusted iron collar around her neck had been whispering to her. It hummed in the dark, vibrating against her pulse whenever her emotions spiked. She knew it was not a simple slave collar. It was a seal. Ilara ran her cold, bruised fingers over the spines of the ancient tomes. She pulled down a heavy, leather-bound ledger detailing the forgotten histories of Iron Peak and the lost Moon Tea Temple. Dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through the narrow Gothic windows. As she flipped the fragile pages, looking for any mention of a sealed bloodline or a white wolf, the iron collar around her neck began to grow warm again. Then, the sound of heavy boots echoed on the spiral stone staircase. Ilara quickly shoved the book back into its place and grabbed a nearby rag, dropping to her knees to scrub the floor just as the heavy oak door creaked open. The towering figure of Alpha King Cailan Vance stepped into the dim room. He had shed his formal midnight blue royal coat, wearing only a tailored black tunic that clung to his broad shoulders and lean, muscular torso. Without the heavy layers of royal regalia, he looked less like an untouchable monarch and more like a lethal, predatory lichen. The air in the library instantly thickened, suffocating the space with his overwhelming alpha aura. Ilara kept her head down, her hands moving the dry rag in rhythmic circles over the dusty stone. She expected him to demand why the room was still filthy, or to bark a command. Instead, Cailan walked silently past her. He stopped in front of the massive, unlit stone hearth. With a flick of his wrist, he grabbed an old iron poker, struck a flint, and ignited the dry kindling stacked within. Flames roared to life, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the cold stone walls. An Alpha King did not light fires for Omegas. Ilara paused, her rag hovering over the floor. She slowly looked up at his broad back, bewildered by the quiet, deliberate gesture of protection. The heat from the hearth immediately began to thaw her freezing limbs, but she remained perfectly still. Cailan turned around, his ice-blue eyes locked onto her kneeling form. The scent of white lilies and frost was intoxicatingly strong in the enclosed room, wrapping around his mind, dragging his wolf to the very surface. "You are not cleaning, Omega," Kaelin observed. His voice was low, vibrating in the quiet room. He glanced at the bookshelf she had just stepped away from. The dust on the floor revealed her clear footprints, leading straight to the ancient history section. "Are you looking for something?" "Just assessing the scope of my punishment, my king," Elara replied evenly. She stood up, refusing to cower on the floor. The firelight caught the golden specks in her hazel eyes, and for a fleeting second, Kaelin saw an ancient, untouchable authority in her gaze. It defied every law he had ever been taught about pack hierarchy. He stepped closer. One deliberate step, then another. Elara's breath hitched, but she anchored her feet to the stone. She would not back away. The rusted iron collar around her throat flared with heat, reacting violently to his proximity. The tiny, microscopic crack along the metal seemed to hum. Kaelin stopped just inches from her. He was so tall she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. From this distance, he could see every detail of the damage done to her. The dark, ugly purple bruises blooming under the rusted iron collar. The raw, scraped skin on her hands. The way her frayed dress offered absolutely no dignity. His black lichen let out a tormented, agonizing sound within his mind. The instinct to claim, to heal, to destroy whoever had put that collar on her was so fierce it made Kaelin's blood burn. Slowly, almost against his own will, Kaelin raised his hand. His large, calloused fingers reached toward her neck. He wanted to touch the rusted metal. He wanted to feel the pulse fluttering beneath the bruised skin and tear the iron apart with his bare hands. Elara's eyes widened slightly. She did not flinch, but her jaw tightened, bracing for pain. That subtle bracing, that quiet expectation of cruelty, but Kaelin harder than a physical blow. She expected him to hurt her. Why wouldn't she? His laws, his court, his silence had allowed her to be treated like nothing. Kaelin's hand stopped mid-air, inches from her throat. He could not touch her. Not yet. He had not earned the right. Slowly he curled his fingers into a fist and lowered his arm to his side, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. "Stay near the fire," Kaelin commanded, his voice rougher, darker than before. "I will not have it said that the King of Iron Peak lets his servants freeze to death." It was an excuse, a flimsy shield to hide the raging storm inside him. Ella. Ra looked at him, truly looked at him, realizing for the first time that the terrifying Alpha King was fighting a war within himself. Before either of them could speak again, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the spiral staircase outside. It wasn't the rhythmic march of a guard. It was the slow, deliberate stride of someone carrying immense authority. Kaelin's head snapped toward the door, his eyes turning cold and sharp. "My king," a smooth, venomous voice called out, just as the door swung open. Elder Silas stood in the doorway, his dark robes sweeping the floor, carrying a sealed parchment bound in royal red ribbon. "I apologize for the intrusion, but the council has reached a decision. It is time we discuss the prophecy of your true mate." The heavy oak door groaned as Elder Silas stepped fully into the circular library. Kaelin smoothly shifted his posture, placing himself between the roaring hearth and the door. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but it effectively shielded Ilara's kneeling form from the elder's immediate line of sight. His ice-blue eyes hardened, stripping away the vulnerability he had shown just seconds prior. He was no longer a man fighting his instincts. He was the untouchable Alpha King of Iron Peak. "You enter unannounced, Silas," Kaelin stated, his voice carrying the dangerous, quiet rumble of a coming storm. "And you speak of council decisions made without their king present. You tread a very thin line." Silas bowed smoothly, a practiced gesture that held no genuine respect. He was an older wolf, his hair silvered with age, his robes immaculate. In his weathered hands, he held a thick roll of aged parchment, sealed with a heavy crimson ribbon. "Forgive my urgency, Alpha King," Silas murmured, his tone dripping with false humility. "But the survival of our pack depends on the strength of our bloodlines. The High Council has unearthed a forgotten text from the ruined Moon Temple. A prophecy, hidden for generations." Silas held the parchment forward like a weapon. "It dictates that the true prosperity of Iron Peak can only be secured when the Alpha King mates with the highest-ranking female of noble blood. The stars have aligned. Lyra is not only my daughter, but the decree confirms she is your destined Luna. The pack grows restless, my king. They need stability. They need a queen." Kaelin stared at the crimson-ribboned parchment. His face remained an impenetrable mask of cold marble, but inside, his black lichen recoiled violently. The very idea of bonding with Lyra made his skin crawl. His beast snapped and snarled, utterly rejecting the supposed prophecy. Kneeling near the hearth, Ilara kept her head lowered, her rag still pressed against the stone. But she was listening to every word. A forgotten text from the ruined Moon Temple. It was a blatant, calculated lie. Ilara knew the ancient texts better than anyone. She was the last true descendant of the Moon Temple's bloodline. The text Silas held was a forgery, a desperate manipulation designed to legitimize his family's grip on the throne. As the sheer audacity of Silas's lie settled over her, something shifted deep within Ilara's chest. For years, the wolf inside her had been forced into a comatose slumber by the dark magic of the rusted iron collar. But now, fueled by the proximity of her true mate and the insult to her sacred lineage, the white wolf stirred. A low psychic growl echoed through Ilara's mind, a sound of ancient, unyielding authority. Instantly, the iron collar around her neck flared with intense heat. It burned against her bruised skin, fighting to suppress the rising power. Ilara gritted her teeth, her bruised hands gripping the wet rag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She refused to make a sound. She would not give Silas the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. Silas finally noticed her. His dark eyes narrowed in disgust as he peered past Kaelin's broad shoulder, catching sight of the ash-stained dress and the iron collar. "Why is this piece of filth in the royal archives?" Silas spat, his smooth demeanor cracking. "An Omega has no place in a room of knowledge. Shall I call the guards to drag her to the dungeons where she belongs?" The temperature in the room plummeted. Kaelin's alpha aura spiked, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on Silas with the weight of a physical blow. "She is fulfilling a disciplinary task I personally assigned," Kaelin said softly, his tone laced with lethal warning. "Do you question my judgment, Elder? Do you presume to tell me how to manage my palace?" Silas swallowed hard, taking a half-step back as his own wolf submitted to the sheer dominance of the Alpha King. "No, my king. I only meant to say—" "You meant to overstep," Kaelin interrupted smoothly. He did not reach for the parchment. He simply stared Silas down with piercing ice-blue eyes. "I will read your supposedly forgotten decree when I see fit. Do not mistake my patience for compliance. My choice of a Luna will not—" Up on the dais, Kaelin's control shattered. The laws of his father, the expectations of the council, the politics of the kingdom, none of it mattered. His black lichen roared, a sound that echoed violently in Kaelin's own mind as the intoxicating scent of white lilies and winter frost flooded his senses. Before the first guard could even raise his arm, a terrifying, suffocating wave of pure alpha dominance crashed over the entire banquet hall. Goblets shattered on the tables. Several weaker nobles collapsed to their knees, clutching their throats as the air grew impossibly heavy. Kaelin moved with blinding, supernatural speed. He was off the throne and standing between Elara and the guards in the blink of an eye. The first guard swung his baton out of blind momentum. Kaelin didn't even draw a weapon. He caught the thick, solid wood with his bare hand. Crack! Kaelin crushed the heavy baton in his grip, snapping the wood into splinters. He dropped the broken pieces to the marble floor, his ice-blue eyes blazing with a feral, murderous light as he stared the terrified guards down. "Take one more step toward her," Kaelin whispered. The quietness of his voice was far deadlier than a shout. "And I will tear you apart." The guards immediately dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, exposing their necks in complete submission. The banquet hall was paralyzed. The Alpha King had just broken centuries of Iron Peak law. He had publicly shielded an Omega, threatening his own royal guards over a spilled cup of wine. "Kaelin!" Silas shouted, his voice cracking with shock and outrage. "What are you doing? She is an Omega. You humiliate the council. You humiliate your future Luna." "She is not my Luna," Kaelin sneered, his voice ringing with absolute finality. He turned his back on Silas and Lyra, dismissing their existence entirely. He looked down at Elara. She was standing so close to him now. She hadn't flinched when the guard raised the weapon, and she wasn't trembling now. She looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide, seeing the man who had just thrown away his perfect, untouchable rule to stand between her and the world. "Are you hurt?" Kaelin asked softly, the harshness in his voice completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate need to protect. "No," Elara breathed, her chest rising and falling quickly. The heat radiating between them was undeniable. As Kaelin looked at her, his gaze dropped to her neck. The rusted iron collar was vibrating. The deep crack that had formed in the library was spreading rapidly. The dark magic binding the metal was failing, overwhelmed by the sheer force of Elara's rising courage and the proximity of her true mate's protective aura. With a sharp, piercing snap, a piece of the rusted iron broke off. A blinding, pure silver light erupted from the crack in the collar. It was not fire, but a cold, divine illumination that forced Kaelin to shield his eyes. The light spilled across the obsidian pillars, banishing the shadows of the banquet hall. And then, cast against the high black marble wall behind Elara, a shadow appeared. It was not the shadow of a small, fragile servant. It was the massive, regal silhouette of a giant white wolf. The royal banquet hall was trapped in a suffocating, terrified silence. Every eye was fixed on the massive, regal silhouette of the white wolf cast against the black marble wall. The blinding silver light spilling from the cracked, rusted collar around Ilara's neck pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The scent of white lilies and winter frost was no longer a subtle whisper. It had bloomed into a commanding, undeniable force that blanketed the room, making the wolves of Iron Peak bare their throats in instinctive awe. Cailan stood frozen, his black lichen humming with absolute reverence. The puzzle pieces of her untouched dignity, her piercing gaze, and the intense, maddening pull in his chest slammed together. She wasn't a mere Omega. She never was. "Witchcraft!" The shrill, panicked voice of Elder Silas ripped through the awe-struck silence. The older wolf scrambled down the steps of the dais, his face pale with terror and desperation. "Do not look at it! It is a trick! The Omega is a witch! She has used dark magic to cast an illusion and bewitch our Alpha King." Lyra, clutching her wine-stained gown, immediately echoed her father. "Kill her, before her curse infects the entire pack! Guards, strike her down!" The remaining guards hesitated, their hands hovering over their weapons, terrified of the Alpha King standing as an immovable shield before the girl. "Anyone who draws a blade in this hall," Cailan's voice vibrated with a dark, lethal promise, "will lose their hands." He did not raise his voice, but the absolute dominance in his tone pinned the guards to the floor. Cailan squared his broad shoulders, his midnight blue coat flaring slightly as he turned to face Silas. He was choosing her. In front of the neighboring alphas, in front of the council, he was actively defying the iron-clad laws of his own kingdom. "You dare speak of witchcraft, Silas?" Cailan growled, stepping forward. "Look at the light. Look at the shadow. That is not dark magic. That is pure, ancient blood." "It is a lie," Silas spat, though he was trembling, backing away from Cailan's furious aura. "She is a stray, a wolfless parasite. My king, you are under a spell. Council, do you not see? The Omega has compromised his mind. By the ancient laws of Iron Peak, she must be executed to save the crown." The whispers among the nobles erupted into a chaotic roar. Some elders stepped forward, their faces hardened by centuries of prejudice, genuinely believing the king was under a dark influence. The pressure of the entire court converged on Cailan and the fragile girl behind him. But Ilara did not want to be a victim hiding behind a king's cloak. She took a slow, deliberate breath. The fire in her collar burned hotter, a divine heat that no longer brought pain, but clarity. With quiet, unbroken grace, Ilara stepped around Cailan. She moved to the forefront, her frayed, ash-stained dress trailing over the broken splinters of the guard's baton. The silver light from her collar illuminated her bruised, dirt-smudged face, highlighting the absolute fearlessness in her hazel eyes. Cailan turned to look at her, ready to pull her back, but the raw, unyielding authority radiating from her small frame stopped him in his tracks. "It is not magic, Silas," Ilara's voice rang out. It was a beautiful, resonant sound that effortlessly cut through the shouting of the panicked hall. "It is the blood you tried to bury." The room fell dead silent once more. Ilara lifted her bruised hand and pointed directly at the trembling elder. 20 years ago, the high priestess of the Moon Temple was murdered in her sleep. Her only daughter vanished. You told the council the child perished in the fires, but you lied. Silas's face contorted in sheer panic. Silence! Do not listen to her madness. You could not kill a child of the Moon Temple without incurring the wrath of the gods, Ilara continued, her voice steady and relentless. So you stole me. You bound my wolf with a cursed iron collar and threw me into the dirt of Iron Peak, branding me an Omega. You forced me into servitude so no one would ever look closely enough to see the true heir standing right in front of them. Gasps rippled through the visiting alphas. The Moon Temple bloodline was sacred, thought to be entirely extinct. Kaelin's chest heaved. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The rusted collar wasn't a mark of low status. It was a prison. He had allowed the true White Queen to scrub his floors and freeze in his courtyards. The guilt and fury that spiked within his black lichen were agonizing. If she is a witch, Kaelin declared, his voice echoing with devastating finality as he stepped up right beside Ilara, then I am her weapon. Anyone who wishes to challenge her truth will have to go through me. Silas looked around the hall. The nobles were stepping back from him. The guards were refusing to move. His decades of manipulation, his carefully forged decrees, and his daughter's stolen future were crumbling to ash before his eyes. Desperation is a dangerous thing. You will not ruin my family, Silas shrieked. His eyes turned pitch black. Reaching under his heavy robes, the elder pulled out a jagged, blackened stone, a conduit of the same dark magic used to forge Ilara's collar. He raised his hand, channeling a lethal, shadowy force directly toward Ilara's chest. Ilara! Kaelin roared, lunging forward to intercept the deadly strike. But the dark magic hit the rusted iron collar first. The ancient, corrupted metal absorbed the brutal impact. It groaned, glowing with an unbearable, blinding heat as it finally reached its absolute breaking point. Time seemed to fracture inside the banquet hall. Kaelin lunged forward, his black lichen roaring in absolute terror as the lethal wave of dark magic tore through the air toward Ilara. He reached for her, ready to absorb the devastating blow with his own body, willing to sacrifice his life and his crown to save the girl he had failed for so long. But he was a fraction of a second too late. The dark energy slammed directly into Ilara's chest. A horrific, booming sound echoed through the black marble pillars, like a thunderclap trapped inside a cavern. Kaelin braced for the agonizing sight of her falling. Instead, the rusted iron collar absorbed the entire sight. Trike. For 2 decades, the cursed metal had suppressed the blood of the Moon Temple, but Silas's desperate, panicked attack was the final catalyst it needed. The ancient collar could no longer contain the divine force rising from within Ilara's soul. With a sound like shattering glass, the heavy iron collar violently burst apart. It did not explode into jagged shrapnel. The moment the pieces broke away from Ilara's bruised skin, they disintegrated mid-air, turning into harmless, drifting silver ash. The dark magic Silas had unleashed was instantly vaporized, swallowed by a blinding, immaculate white light that erupted from Ilara's very being. Kaelin was thrown back, not by a violent blast, but by a warm, impenetrable shockwave of pure energy. He landed gracefully on his feet several yards away, his arm raised to shield his eyes. When the blinding intensity of the light finally softened, the entire hall stopped breathing. Elara was no longer just a servant in a frayed, ash-stained dress. The silver light clung to her, illuminating her fragile frame and making the torn fabric look like a gown spun from starlight. The dark, ugly bruises around her neck where the collar had chafed her skin were rapidly fading, healed by the surging power of her awakened bloodline. Slowly, Elara opened her eyes. The deep hazel was gone. In its place, her eyes glowed with a breathtaking, liquid silver, the undisputed mark of the true White Queen. The heavy, oppressive scent of white lilies and winter frost swept through the hall like a cleansing storm. It washed away the metallic tang of fear and the foul stench of Silas's dark magic. It was a scent that commanded absolute peace, yet carried the undeniable weight of supreme authority. Behind her, the massive shadow on the black marble wall detached itself. A collective, terrified gasp echoed from the visiting Alphas and the Iron Peak nobles. Stepping out of the ethereal light was a majestic, giant white wolf. Its fur shimmered like fresh snowfall under a full moon, and its eyes burned with the same piercing silver as Elara's. It did not snarl. It did not bare its teeth in a display of savage bloodlust. It simply stood beside Elara, towering over the crowd, radiating an ancient, holy pressure that forced the wolves in the room to confront the sheer magnitude of their own insignificance. Elder Silas dropped the blackened stone. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely stand. The dark magic he had relied on for decades was stripped away in an instant, neutralized by the pure presence of the Moon Temple's air. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the edge of the dais. "No," Silas whispered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its previous arrogant venom. "It cannot be. You were nothing. You were dirt." Elara did not shout. She simply took a step forward. The giant white wolf mirrored her movement, its massive paws making no sound on the polished floor. "I was what you made me, Silas," Elara said. Her voice resonated through the hall, carrying a dual cadence, her own calm tone overlapping with the ancient psychic resonance of her wolf. "You bound me in iron and dressed me in ash. You let the pack mock me, starve me, and break my bones. But you forgot one crucial truth about the Moon Temple." She paused, her silver eyes locking onto the trembling elder. "You can chain a wolf in the dark, but you can never extinguish the moon." Lyra, who had been cowering near the high table, let out a pathetic sob and collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands. The false crown she wore seemed to weigh heavily on her head, a pathetic imitation of the divine right standing before her. From the periphery, Kaelin watched the woman he was bound to. His black lichen, usually so dominant, so fiercely protective of its territory, was completely quiet. It was bowing in his mind. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King felt a profound, crushing sense of humility. He looked at Elara's bare, bruised feet on the cold stone. He thought of the times she had scrubbed the frozen courtyard while he watched from his high balcony, too proud and too chained by protocol to intervene. She had possessed this godlike power all along, yet she had endured their cruelty with silent dignity, never once using it to destroy them until the truth demanded to be known. She was a queen who had earned her crown through endurance, not inheritance. Elara turned her head slightly, her silver eyes finding Kaelin in the crowd. The connection between them snapped perfectly into place, a mate bond no longer muffled by rust and dark magic. It roared to life, a searing, beautiful tether that anchored Kaelin's soul to hers. Then, the white wolf beside Elara lifted its massive head. It did not howl with sound. Instead, it released a silent, psychic shockwave, a command of absolute, undeniable royal authority that rippled through the blood of every single lichen and wolf in the Black Marble Palace. The psychic shockwave released by the white wolf carried no physical force, yet its impact was more devastating than a physical blow. It was the raw, unfiltered weight of the true royal bloodline, a command encoded into the very DNA of every lichen and wolf present. It bypassed their pride, their politics, and their prejudices.